In his 1970 interview, the world champion Boris Spassky was asked to choose his best chess game. Out of all the incredible games he had played, he chose this one. Indeed, this game is truly impressive, as Spassky played it in the romantic style, sacrificing 4 pawns one by one to mobilize his army as quickly as possible. After that, another spectacular sacrifice follows, and I'll challenge you to find these brilliant moves. So let's dive into this masterpiece of the great champion who, sadly, passed away just a few days ago. Spassky starts with e4 and his opponent Aron Reshko plays the Caro-Kann defense. And instead of a more common d4, Spassky goes for the two knights variation, developing the first knight and after d5 the second knight. The idea of this variation is to develop the pieces as soon as possible, also retaining options regarding the d-pawn. As you see, this pawn hasn't moved yet, so white will have an option either to push the pawn to d3 or d4. Now black has two main moves, either to exchange on e4 or to develop the bishop before playing e6, which would have locked the bishop within the pawn chain. Black goes for the second option. He develops his bishop, also pinning the white knight. Spassky attacks the bishop, and now again black has to make a choice, either to exchange the bishop for the knight or to retreat to h5. If he retreats, then white would get a chance to centralize his knight. After e takes d, c takes d and possible bishop b5 check, white can unpin his knight and centralize it, and this knight would have put a very strong pressure on black's position. For this reason, after h3 it's better to exchange, after which of course white gets the advantage of two bishops. However, the position is closed, and in closed positions it isn't easy to exploit the advantage of two bishops. Black develops the king's knight, and here white could have made a quiet move d3 or a natural looking d4, but instead Spassky goes for the most aggressive continuation e5, crossing the center of the board with a tempo and grabbing space on the king side. The knight retreats to d7 and attacks the pawn. And the most natural way of defending the pawn, of course, would be d4, but instead Spassky defends the pawn with the queen. And queen g3 has another idea. The queen is putting pressure on g7, making the development of the king side for black problematic. So black plays e6, but next move he won't be able to develop the bishop because the g7 pawn would fall, black's king side would be demolished, and the pawn would fall with a tempo because the rook would also fall under attack. Spassky develops his bishop, and now as he has difficulties in developing his king side and the queen side isn't developed either, the best move for black would have been c5, vacating the c6 square for the knight, followed by knight c6, after which both knights would have attacked the e5 pawn, and from c6 the knight can also jump on d4, targeting the c2 pawn. So black would have got a comfortable play in this case. But instead of c5, black makes a move which looks completely natural. Queen c7. Indeed, what can be more natural than developing the queen with a tempo? Black is again threatening to capture on e5. However, as we will see, queen c7 was an inaccuracy. Because after Spassky defends the e5 pawn, it turns out that black cannot play c5 right away. Now that the queen is placed on c7, the white knight can invade b5 with a tempo, and after the black queen retreats, the knight can invade d6 with a check, and after black captures, the white queen can capture on g7 with a tempo, destroying black's king side. For this reason, black prepares the c5 advance by playing a6 first, taking this square under control to prevent the white knight from jumping there. And now he is ready to play c5 next move, followed by knight c6 and maybe even long castle. So now that we know black's intentions, you can pause the video and try to find Spassky's next move, and not just the move, but the idea, the follow-up. So Spassky prevents black from developing his queen side by playing first b4. Of course, if black captures the pawn, The white queen again captures on g7. So black plays c5. Now he's ready to develop his knight, but now we can see the point of b4. The pawn moves to b5, taking this square under control, and the black knight doesn't have any squares to move. And of course, black still cannot capture on b5, so for the same reason, because the white knight would invade b5 with a tempo also eyeing the d6 square. For this reason, as he has difficulties in developing his kingside and he cannot develop his queenside either, black plays c4, vacating the c5 square for his pieces and also opening this diagonal. So this is quite important. For example, white cannot make the natural move short castle, because this time black can capture on b5, because knight cannot recapture because of queen c5 check, and the knight is lost. For this reason, after c4, instead of castling, Spassky plays rook b1, developing his rook and overprotecting the b5 pawn. And black still cannot capture for the same reason. Knight takes b5 would follow with a tempo. That's why, before capturing on b5, black first kicks the knight out of c3. And only after the knight moves, but actually the knight jumps on a great square, on a central square, also eyeing the d6 square, only now black captures on b5, and it turns out that Spassky actually sacrificed the pawn, because white cannot recapture it. If the rook captures, that would be a blunder because of queen c6. With the double attack, white is losing material. So after black captured on b5, he's up a pawn, and he's also targeting the second pawn. The a file has opened. What should white do now? The engine recommends knight d6 check, and after bishop takes d6, e takes d, queen takes d6, and queen takes g7, the rook moves to f8, and the engine gives a slight advantage to white. So it's true, black's kingside is demolished. However, the white pawn, the very strong pawn, which used to be on e5 and put pressure on black's position, and the great centralized knight have disappeared. And that means the tension has been reduced, has been released, and seems that Spassky didn't feel like playing this variation. Instead, he goes for the romantic chess. Instead of releasing the tension, he accumulates more energy by sacrificing the second pawn. He castles kingside, ensuring the king's safety and bringing one more piece, the rook, into play. And black accepts the sacrifice. Now he is 2 pawns up, and the c2 pawn is also under attack. But Spassky sacrificed this pawn too, again to mobilize his pieces as soon as possible. He plays d3, moving the pawn away from the bishop's diagonal. Now there is only one pawn in front of the bishop, and black accepts this sacrifice too. Now he is 3 pawns up, and with the tempo, the bishop is under attack. That's why Spassky plays bishop d1, attacking the rook in his turn. And here black makes a mistake. He is already 3 pawns up, but he is behind in development. So he should thought about returning some of the material he has won. He could do that by sacrificing the exchange, by eliminating one of white's attacking pieces, reducing his opponent's attacking potential. And after rook takes c1, it turns out that for the exchange, black has a very good compensation. He has 3 pawns, so we can actually say that black is still up in material. Besides that, after c3, he can get the protected passed pawn. He also has the opportunity to create later in the game the connected passed pawns. But white in his turn, of course, as the black king is still in the center, white can initiate an attack by playing bishop b3, putting pressure on the diagonal, on this diagonal, and preparing f5, which would open the bishop's diagonal and also open the f-file, exposing the black king, and with a very complicated game. However, instead of this, instead of returning some of the material he has won, black decided to keep all the material. So he saves his rook instead of sacrificing the exchange. He plays rook a2. so he's still 3 pawns up. But he's behind in development. So what should white do next? You can pause the video and try to find Spassky's next move. So when you are ahead in development, you should play energetically, otherwise the development advantage can disappear. And besides that, black, besides trying to complete his development, black can also initiate a counterplay by c3, creating the protected passed pawn and immediately threatening c2 with a fork. So white must play energetically. And that's exactly what Spassky does. He sacrifices the fourth pawn, f5. The f pawn has moved away from f4, it isn't defending the e5 pawn, the valuable pawn, the most important pawn. Now black will be able to capture it. But the idea behind the sacrifice of the fourth pawn is to initiate the attack. If the sacrifice of the first 3 pawns was just to mobilize the pieces as soon as possible, the sacrifice of the fourth pawn is meant to initiate the attack, to expose the black king and to activate the pieces. Now the f file will open and the pawn from f4, it has moved to f5, and the bishop's diagonal is also open, so the white pieces are ready to start an attack on the black king. So white is threatening to capture on e6, so black must do something about it. If he captures on f5 himself, then after rook takes f5, it turns out that black doesn't have defense against terrible threats white has. White actually has 3 threats. The first one is e6, with the discovered attack on the black queen and attacking the knight. And if after e6 the black queen captures on g3, of course first the pawn would capture on d7 with a check, and only then the white knight would recapture the black queen and white would be up a piece. The second threat white has in this position is rook takes f7, and after king takes f7 again e6 check with the discovered attack, and black is losing the queen. And the third threat, of course, is again the same threat, knight d6 check, and after bishop takes d6, e takes d with a tempo, and after the black queen retreats, the white queen captures on g7, destroying black's kingside. So after f5, black cannot capture on f5, so he must capture the e5 pawn. If he captures with the queen, then bishop f4 would attack the queen, and after the queen retreats, white would capture on b7, winning a piece, and his attack would continue. For this reason, black captures on e5 with the knight. And now Spassky captures on e6. He captures his first pawn, actually, and he has created an immediate threat. The f-file has opened, and white is threatening to capture on f7, invading the 7th rank with a tempo. And of course, after rook takes f7, black won't be able to capture the rook with the knight, because the knight is pinned. The queen would be lost in this case. So black must do something about the threat of rook takes f7. If he captures on e6, then his king would get exposed and would turn into a target of a terrible attack. White would have played bishop f4, pinning the knight, threatening to capture it. Black must defend the knight, knight d7 for example, after which white can capture the pawn, not to capture the pawn of course, but to attack the knight for the 3rd time. And black cannot defend with bishop d6 of course, for the same reason, g7 would fall. So the only defense would be rook a5, defending the knight and attacking the rook, but white can defend his rook with d takes c, and it turns out that black is paralyzed. His knight is pinned, his second knight together with the queen are tied to the defense of the e5 knight, the bishop still cannot move, the rook is out of play, and the only thing the second rook, the a5 rook, can do is to exchange itself for the b5 rook. So black cannot move, while white is going to play knight g5, attacking the e6 pawn, or bishop g4, again attacking the e6 pawn, so this pawn will fall and black's position would collapse. For this reason, after Spassky captured on e6, instead of recapturing, black, in order to keep the position closed, plays f6, also reinforcing his knight. his most important piece, the great centralized knight. And we have reached another critical position. You can pause the video and try to find Spassky's next move. The engine recommends the obvious rook takes b5 and gives white a big advantage. But instead of this obvious move, Spassky keeps playing romantic chess. After sacrificing 4 pawns, in order to completely expose the black king and start a very dangerous attack on him, and in order to undermine the knight, which is defended by the pawn, Spassky sacrifices the rook. Rook takes f6. Now the knight isn't defended by the pawn. And white is threatening to invade f7 again, so black has no choice. He must accept the sacrifice. G takes f. And again, the pawn falls. The knight is now defended only by the queen, and, which is even more important of course, the black king must move, and he becomes a target of attack. The king has only 2 squares to move, but if he moves to e7, black is losing on the spot after knight d5 with a fork. White is winning the queen, so the only move is king d8. But the knight still jumps on d5 with a tempo, taking under control the important e7 and c7 squares, and the knight is also the knight coordinates very well with the pawn, because the pawn controls the d7 square, and the black king is cut on the 7th rank, so he has only 2 squares to move. Besides that, the knight has moved away from f6. That means this diagonal is open, and the white bishop will invade g5 with a check next move. And black won't be able to close with bishop e7 because the knight also controls this square. But at the moment, the black queen is under attack. And the queen must also keep an eye on the knight, otherwise the white queen would capture it. So the black queen has only 2 squares, d6 and g7, to defend the knight. If she moves to g7, then the simplest continuation for white would be e7 check, as black cannot capture because he would lose the queen. So the best move is, instead of queen g7, is queen d6, the only move. The queen defends the knight and also attacks the white knight. But now, one by one, Spassky will bring both of his bishops into the attack. First, the dark squared bishop with a check. The king has only 2 squares to move. If he moves to e8, then white is winning on the spot. After bishop h5 check, knight g6, so the black queen is defended, but white can play knight c7 check, forcing her to capture the knight, after which she is unguarded and white simply captures her with a checkmate next move. For this reason, the only move is king c8. And now the light squared bishop comes into play. Bishop g4, creating a terrible threat. There is a very unpleasant x-ray now, and white is threatening to play e7 with the discovered check, followed by e8, promoting to the queen. This reason, black doesn't have time to capture the knight. He must do something about the threat of e7 followed by e8. And here black made another mistake. Actually, he had only one move to hold the position. But this move, and not just the move, but the whole idea, was almost impossible to find for a human. So it's a computer line I'm gonna show you now. So the first move is relatively easy to find. Bishop g7. The idea is to open the rook's way, preventing e7, e8. Now e7 wouldn't be so, e7 check wouldn't be so dangerous because the pawn cannot promote anyways. But black should have seen the follow-up, which was almost impossible to see for a human. So instead of e7, white can play knight e7 check. And after that, knight f5 would fork the queen and the bishop. And black cannot defend the bishop. If he plays queen f8, for example, trying to defend it, white plays bishop e7, attacking the queen, and then bishop d6 check, followed by bishop takes e5, eliminating black's best piece, and white is winning. But black had another move instead of queen f8, the computer move, counterintuitive move. Queen a3. The black king is under attack, but black voluntarily moves his queen away, far away from the king, also letting white capture the bishop. But the idea is to increase the pressure on d3. Because black has very dangerous pawns, and if the d3 pawn falls, black would have 3 connected passed pawns. So white accepts the sacrifice in this variation. Black still doesn't have time to capture the pawn because his knight is under attack. He must defend the knight, after which white plays e7, and we get a chaotic position, total chaos. Black is at the moment up the exchange. He has very dangerous pawns. In his turn, white is ready to promote to the queen, after which black would be forced to give up the rook, and the knight would move to e8 with a check. White still has 2 dangerous bishops. He still might continue his attack on the black king. So for a human it is impossible to evaluate this position, but computer says that it's absolutely equal. But of course human couldn't find this idea with bishop g7 and sacrificing this bishop and moving his queen to a3, attacking d3. So instead of this, instead of bishop g7, in order to parry the threat of e7 with the discovered check, black makes the human move, the most obvious move that first comes to mind. White is threatening e7 with the discovered check, so this bishop should be eliminated. Besides that, white is attacking, black is defending, and when you defend, it's always a good idea to exchange pieces in order to reduce the attacking potential, the attacking resources of your opponent. So knight takes g4, but this move proves to be a mistake. However, at first sight it isn't clear why this move is a mistake. Black has captured the bishop. Now there is no bishop on g4, so e7 would come without a check, so it doesn't look dangerous anymore. Besides that, the black knight has moved away from e5. That means the white queen is under attack. So what should white do now? What has Spassky prepared? You can pause the video and try to find it. So, of course, the obvious move is to recapture the knight. So, however, it doesn't work. So, the white queen is under attack, but if white recaptures, again, renewing the threat of e7 with the discovered check, then black can play bishop g7 again, but this time it's easy to find because, so again, bishop g7 opens the rook's way, so e7 check isn't dangerous, and if white plays knight e7 check, just like in the variation, the computer line I have just shown you. This time it doesn't work. After knight f5 with a fork, black can simply sacrifice this bishop, capturing this annoying pawn, and after knight takes g7, black can exchange the queens, after which white doesn't have attacking resources anymore, black is up material, and black is completely winning. So the obvious move, queen takes g4, doesn't work, but Spassky prepared e7, still e7, although it comes without the discovered check, still it's very strong. Because white creates 2 threats. The first one is to promote to the queen. For this reason, black cannot actually capture the white queen, because promotion would be also a checkmate in 1. And the second threat after e7, besides promoting, is simply to capture the queen, because the bishop isn't defending her anymore. So black has no choice. He must capture on e7 with the bishop, and that was exactly the idea behind e7. Spassky induces his opponent to capture on e7 with the bishop, and we will see why. So black still has a great material advantage. He's up a rook and 2 pawns. However, now Spassky will get back all sacrificed material with interest. First, he captures the knight with a check, and after knight d7, now we see why he induced the bishop to e7. Now he captures the bishop again with a check. If the king moves to d8, then knight f5, discovered check, and black is losing the queen. So the king must move to one of these squares. but on both of these squares he would be placed on this diagonal. So the king moves to c7 in our game and bishop f4, pinning the queen. The only way to save the queen is knight e5, of course. But now queen g7, creating a terrible threat of bishop takes e5, not just winning the knight, but also pinning and winning the black queen. Besides that, the rook is under attack. So black must save his queen. He moves the king away from this diagonal so that the queen doesn't get pinned after bishop takes e5, which was exactly what Spassky played. Now both the queen and the rook are still under attack. The queen moves, and before capturing the rook, Spassky first captures on d4 because it comes with a check. And next move he will capture the rook and he would be 2 pieces up. For example, after king a5, queen takes h8, white is 2 pieces up, his attack on the black king continues, and black cannot even capture the knight because that runs into checkmate in 1. For this reason, after bishop takes d4 check, black resigned. And now I recommend watching one of Spassky's most fantastic games, which features one of the most creative rook sacrifices in chess history. But first, I'd be grateful if you like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.